you're back. And guess what? We're going to finish Esther part 4. I know it took a lot of videos to get to this point, 4 of them. Today's the 4th, but there's so much in this story, so much of God's hand moving, so many moving parts and characters. And you remember that I said way in the beginning that God's name is never even mentioned. But I know that through this story in the book of Esther, he is inviting us, those that read his word, to look for him. And he is everywhere in the story. It is so exciting. With every plot twist, with every change of the story, we know that God is in control and his hand is upon every single person, especially his children, especially those that have their hearts surrendered to him. So we're just going to recap just a little bit so then we can finish the story of Esther. So we remember way back in the first chapter of Esther, the King Ahasuerus, had this big feast, and he calls the Queen Vashti to come before. Remember, it was 180 days, and on the second feast, which was 7 days, he calls for the queen to come. He wanted to show his beautiful queen to all the men of the kingdom, and the queen said, do you remember? No. And she said no and refused to come. So all of his advisors and all of the royal men of the land said, wait a minute, king, you must do something about this. We can't have our wives doing this and not listening to us. So he fires the queen. He gets rid of Queen Vashti. But now the king needs a queen. So they had the beauty contest. Remember, they gathered all the lovely, beautiful young ladies of the land and bring them all to the king. 12 months they had of beauty treatments before they could even see the king. And out of all that, the queen is chosen. But do you remember who? Esther, the Jew who was being raised by her cousin Mordecai, was chosen. But Mordecai, her cousin, said, don't tell them you're a Jew. So nobody knew that Esther was a Jew. And remember the Bible said, back I think it was in chapter 2 that he said, and he loved Esther above all the rest. And that was God's plan. And then do you remember that a man named Haman, wicked, prideful man, came into power. The king made him second in command over all the princes, over all the provinces. But he was a wicked man. And he would go down the streets and he wanted everyone to bow down to him. But Mordecai, being a follower of God, a Jewish man, would not bow to anybody but God. Oh, and this infuriated Haman, and so much so that he found out that Mordecai was a Jew, and he says, I want all Jewish people destroyed. And he tricks the king, he words it differently. The king makes a law that on a certain day, I think it was 11 months from that day, all the Jews of the kingdom would be destroyed. And then the decree was sent on all the land that you could destroy the Jews and take their stuff. So now Mordecai and all the Jews are mourning and fasting, seeking the Lord. What's going to happen? And Mordecai, remember, he was so upset. It was called wailing. He put on sackcloth and ashes by the gate where Esther could see him. Esther gets word, talks to Mordecai. They go back and forth talking. And Mordecai says to her, you need to go talk to the king. You need to go tell him now is the time. This is what God made you for. This is the time that God has you for. And she said, I can't go talk to the king. If you go talk to the king without an invitation, you could die. But listen to the words. Remember those words. And that she said, but I have not been called. And this is what Mordecai said to her. Knowest whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And I wanted to stop there for a moment because you and I are right where we are in this time of history, in the family that you are, in the neighborhood that you are, wherever you are there for such a time as this. Because God is totally in control of your life and my life, and when you were born and when I was born, and he has a purpose and a plan for each of our life. Just like Esther was born for that particular time, and the Lord allowed favor upon her and gave her favor with the king so she could be queen when this moment came so he can glorify himself and save his people. Well, who knows what God has for you to do and what God has for me to do, because he has a plan and a purpose for each and every one of us. God's word says in Psalm 139 that when we were in the womb, inside our mommy's belly, He knew us. He created us. He knitted us together. He knows our thoughts. He knows our ways before we stand up, wherever we go, when we sit down, when we lie down, everywhere. He is acquainted with all of our ways. So great is your purpose and great is mine, just like Esther. And we were born for such a time as this. So that's what Mordecai tells his cousin. For such a time as this, Esther, you are there for a reason. And then Esther comes up with this plan. Okay, Mordecai, tell everyone to fast, which means no food and water for 3 days. She said, I'm going to do the same, and my maidens are going to do the same. And on that third day, I'm going to go see the king. And this is what she says, full of bravery and courage and trusting God. She says, if I perish, I perish. So that's what happens. So remember, then she goes in, she dresses in all her royal robe. She goes in to talk to the king. And then that suspenseful moment, was the king going to be off with her head? No, he extends his scepter, which means you are accepted. She touches the scepter. And then he asked her, what is it that you want, my queen? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. So she invites him and Haman to a feast. And then at that feast, that's where we left off the story. At the feast, does she tell the king everything? No. You know what she does at that feast? Do you remember? She invites him to another banquet at her house. She said, "O king, would you and Haman come to another feast tomorrow?" And that's where we left off in the story. So we left off with the king and the queen and the wicked man Haman at that second feast. So now what is Esther going to do? Is she going to have the courage and boldness to tell him again? But before we find out what happened, do you remember that secret story that was going on behind the scenes? Secret to everybody except for God, because God is always in control. Way back, do you remember Esther's cousin Mordecai, the one that Haman hates, overheard 2 men plotting to kill the king? And Esther told the king about this plot, and it was written for the Chronicles. In the Chronicles, which means the history book of the kingdom. The night before this second banquet, the king couldn't sleep, so that was his bedtime story. They read them the history book of the kingdom. And guess what story the king hears? The one about Mordecai saving his life and exposing those 2 men that wanted to kill him. So the king asked his official, "Did we do anything to honor that man that saved my life?" And the man says, "No." Well, that morning, Haman comes in asking for the head of Mordecai, and the king says to Haman, "I want to honor this man. And what should we do?" And remember the plan? And Haman said, "You should put your crown on him. You should put your robe. You should parade him in the streets and say, 'Hail, everyone.' This is what happens to the man that the king is pleased with." Well, Haman, do you remember secretly? He thought the king was talking about him. So he makes up this whole plan of what should be done. And then this king says, "You go do that to Mordecai." So that's where we end up. Back to the banquet. Second banquet. Now Haman is full of pride. Remember, he told his wife, "I was the only other person invited to this special banquet of the queen." So he's full of pride. The king is still wondering, Esther's up to something. What does she want from me? So he asked her again, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? What is your plea? What is that you're asking for?" And he said again, "Up to half the kingdom I will give to you." That's how much he loved her. That's how much favor was upon her from God, that the king said, "Whatever you want, up to half of everything I own," which was a whole bunch. So listen to what happened. So it says, this is what Esther says to the king. We're in chapter 7 of Esther. And the Queen Esther answers the king, "O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request." So what she's saying, my life and my people's life are in danger. Would you give us our life back? I wonder what the king is thinking at this point. And listen what she continues to say. "For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish." Imagine the king's reaction. She just told him, Lord, King, my life and the life of my people is in danger. We're going to be destroyed. We have been sold because Haman said he'd pay to be able to kill the Jews. And she said, my life was sold. The life of my people were sold. We're going to be destroyed, slain, and perish. And the king says, what? What are you talking about? And listen to what the king says. Then the king, Ahasuerus, answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he? And where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? Who is this person, the king is saying, and who dares to do that against my queen? Oh, the king is angry. But here's the part. Is Esther going to have the courage to point and say, Haman, that man, for such a time as this, God has brought her right here to this moment. The king is angry and Haman's in the room, and Haman, full of so much pride, has no idea that she's a Jew and that it's his command and things are going to turn right now. So listen, ready to what Esther answers? I love this part. Oh, it's so suspenseful. And it says, and Esther said, here we go. The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Right there, she says it. What's going to happen now? So she just told the king. Well, it turns out the king rushes out of the room. He's so angry. And when he comes back, he finds Haman pleading, but he thought that he was attacking the queen. So he has a soldier take Haman, and guess what? In the same way that Haman wanted to kill Mordecai, that same morning wanted the king to kill Mordecai, the same way the king had Mordecai destroyed. Only God could work out those things. Only God can take the plans, the wicked plans of a man, and at that very last minute, what we think is a very last minute, because God is in control the whole time, can God show up and the very same wickedness and evil that was planned for his people, the Jews, God turns it around and uses it against the wicked. Only God could do that. I told you he's all over this book. So then what happens? So Queen Esther is spared, but what about the people? Do you remember I said way, way back when the king made a law, it couldn't be changed. It wasn't like he could send out another decree and said, never mind that law, I got a new law. That was the way that they functioned in their kingdom. When he made a law, nothing can change it. So now what? So Esther is telling the king, my people will still be destroyed. That's great that Haman's gone and you know who I am and you want to save my people, but now what? So another decree goes out. The king makes another decree and says that on that day that the Jews were supposed to be destroyed, the Jews can take up arms and defend themselves. What? So now on that day, if anybody dared to go into the kingdom and try to destroy the Jews, they could fight back, and they had the king's approval. And God's word says that all the leaders of the land joined the Jews and were willing and able to defend them against anybody that would try to destroy them. What? But then here is even a cherry on top of this wonderful story. Remember Mordecai, her cousin? Well, guess what? The king makes Mordecai. We'll put him here next to the king. Second in command. Gave him Haman's place. Gave him his ring. Gave him royal clothes. So now when he went out around the kingdom, everybody knew that Mordecai was the king's second in command, the highest position right under the king. Mordecai, the one that Haman was about to destroy, the one that the decree went out. I'm telling you, God is always in control. I love this story because it encourages my heart that even when things might seem crazy and confusing around us, God's in control. And we might fret and worry, God doesn't. Just like he planned that plot of assassination of the kingdom to be in the history book, just like he planned for the king to read it right before Haman came in, just like he planned for Haman and his wickedness and that decree, and he turned it around and Haman was destroyed by it, I love God. I love to hear how God is always in the midst of our life. He has even those details of a story, of a plot, of a decree. He's in control. Isn't that incredible? That's our God. And I wanted to finish with this scripture. Let's end with what happened that day, the decree of the Jews being destroyed, and then them fighting back. Listen to what happened. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel, in blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And listen to what happened. And the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And the Jews had joy and gladness and a feast and a good day, which means a holiday. It actually turned into a holiday. And many of the people, this is a really important part, and many of the people of the land became Jews. Do you know what that means? That they surrendered to God. So wait a minute, who does Esther follow? Who does Mordecai follow? The one true God? And what did it say? Many people of the land became Jews, which means followers of God. Wow. For the fear of the Jews fell upon them when they realized they had a decree. Remember, this is a whole kingdom. They had a decree, and then another decree came, and the man that was hated by Haman, who was in charge, Haman is now gone, and he's in charge. Wait a minute. What God? Who's doing that? Who's behind all this? And it's evident to everybody, just like it's evident to anybody that reads this story, that God is totally in control. And just like he had a plan for Esther, for such a time as this, for Mordecai, for such a time as this, and even this king, who we could consider not surrendered to the Lord, not a follower of the Lord, he even uses all those people around us, because his plan will never be thwarted. His plan for your life and my life will never be changed, and nobody can change what God has for you and for me. And especially nobody and nothing can change the great love that God has for you and for me. Isn't that incredible? Get in his word. This is just one story of the bazillion stories that God put in his word for us to read. Get in his word. We'll see you next time. God bless you. Bye-bye.